for those of you who haven't heard it, there's a little exchange here which took place on TalkSport between promoter Frank Warren and Tony Bellew, the former WBC World Cruiserweight Champion. And this exchange was about the Anthony Joshua Deontay Wilder situation. And basically Frank Warren is claiming that he has seen the contract, the $50 million contract, which was supposedly sent to Anthony Joshua. And Tony Bellew is disputing the fact that there was a contract, or the claim that there was a contract. Now, all this back and forth between Bellew and Warren is conjecture at the end of the day. It's who do you want to believe? After this exchange, Tony Bellew put this tweet out. And the tweet says, "When you work with honest men and decent individuals, you always know where you stand. I feel for the people, especially in the boxing business, who have to deal with out-and-out liars and fraudsters. Careful who you choose, young fighters, is all I can say." Now that seemed to be a veiled dig, a veiled diss of Frank Warren. For those of you who don't know, Tony Bellew used to be promoted by Frank Warren earlier on in his career, and when he left Warren, the split wasn't exactly amicable. As is often the case with Frank Warren, when fighters leave him, there were, from what I remember, threats of legal action against Tony Bellew coming from Team Warren. And again, that is not uncommon when it comes to fighters leaving Warren. Threats of legal action. So, you know, you can pick your side. You want to believe Warren, you want to believe Bellew, go for it. You can say that both guys have got a vested interest in either defending Joshua in the case of Bellew, or attacking Joshua and defending Wilder in the case of Warren, because Warren is just looking at any way to try and denigrate his main rival in the UK, which is Eddie Hearn. We all know that. If you are someone who's out there acting like Frank Warren has never told a lie, and that Frank Warren is just a straight talker, straight down the line, you know, honest as the day is long, then you are very naive indeed, and you clearly don't know Frank Warren. My approach to it all is, I don't trust any boxing promoter to tell me the right time in a room full of clocks. You know, somebody said to me the other day, "Hatman, don't you think that," because I was talking about how good a show Eddie Hearn put on last weekend with White, Parker, Takam, Chisora and all that. And he said, yeah, it was a good show, but don't you think Eddie Hearn's a snake though? He shouldn't have put Dave Allen in there and, you know, rare tear tear. And I said, of course Eddie Hearn's a snake. But all the other major boxing promoters are snakes too. Well, you think they ain't all snakes? You think Warren's not a snake? You think De La Hoya's not a snake? Schaefer? You know, all these boxing managers like Finkel. I mean, go talk to Shannon Briggs about Shelley Finkel. Just Google Shannon Briggs, Shelley Finkel. You go see what Shannon Briggs, a guy who has had business dealings with Shelley Finkel, go see what he thinks about the man. I don't trust none of these people in boxing. But it all comes down to two things. One, the fighters, and two, the relative trustworthiness of the business people in boxing. Now, I've never seen Eddie Hearn involved in a legal dispute with one of his fighters or former fighters. I've never seen it. I've seen Frank Warren involved in legal disputes with countless numbers of his fighters over the years. I mean, countless numbers. That to me is not a good sign. If I was a professional fighter, which I'm obviously not, I would be concerned when I look at Frank Warren's history and when it comes to being involved in legal disputes with fighters. I'd be concerned about that. Eddie Hearn, I've never seen him involved in a legal dispute with a fighter. So of course Eddie Hearn is going to lie. Of course he's going to bend the truth. Of course, his primary concern is with his bottom line, his money, his income. His primary concern is not the health of the fighters. That's why he can put a guy like Dave Allen in the ring so soon after Allen has been stopped, only a month after the Tony Yoka fight. He had no compunction about doing that. Is this the actions, are these the actions of a man who puts morality first? Of course not. But to act like he is the worst of the worst is a bit of a joke. You clearly don't know the backstory and the history of the other boxing promoters who are still around today. If you think that Eddie Hearn is the worst of the worst in terms of immoral behavior, dishonesty, mistreating fighters, etc. No, you're very naive or biased if you think he's the worst of the worst. He is definitely not. The transparency that Eddie Hearn offers fighters is far beyond anything which existed during the 1990s, which was Frank Warren's prime, if you want to call it that, and also the prime of Eddie Hearn's dad, Barry Hearn. And Barry Hearn has done an interview, many years ago, I think it was on IFL or Seconds Out, where he talked about the fact that in his day, in his heyday, in him and Warren's heyday, fighters were basically like slaves, and the promoter was a slave master. Now, some people might think it's still like that today, but again, we're talking in relative terms here. And relative to how it was back then, fighters get treated way better by people like Eddie Hearn, Oscar De La Hoya, etc. today than they did back in the days in the 90s, during Barry Hearn's heyday. Okay? And Eddie Hearn is spearheading this new breed of promoters. And of course, they're thinking about money first and foremost, but they're not as bad as the promoters used to be in the 90s. They're not as bad as the old school, the old guard of promoters. They're not as bad as them. Frank Warren recently talked about how Eddie Hearn's dad, Barry, was trying back in the days to convince a fighter to get more weight off. He was literally in the sauna with him, trying to get more weight off him so he would go ahead with a fight rather than pull him out of the fight. And Frank Warren was using this as an example of how Barry Hearn was unethical. And again, I'm not doubting that Barry Hearn did unethical things at all. But, I'm sure, I know, Eddie Hearn has done some questionable things. But my response to the person who initially asked me, do I think Eddie Hearn is a snake? My response to them was, as long as the fighter is getting paid fair, as long as everything is transparent, and they're getting paid on time, right? Then that's about as good as a fighter in this day and age can expect. Unless they promote themselves. If they go down the route of being self-promoted, then they're going to get a better deal, potentially, than they would working with a major promoter. And that's why I encourage people like David Haye with his self-promotion throughout his career. I know he's retired now, but when he was still boxing, I liked the fact that he was self-promoted. Even though I had a lot of criticisms about him as a fighter and so on and so forth, I always supported the fact that he was self-promoted. I supported the fact that the Eubanks went down the route of being self-promoted, because I'm always about the fighter being empowered. You understand? Always. You look at my channel consistently over the years, I'm always pro-fighter. I'm always about the fighter being empowered and being self-promoted if that's a viable option. It's not always viable to be self-promoted. Sometimes it's too much work. Sometimes you're not big enough to be self-promoted yet. Sometimes you haven't got the right deal, an exclusive deal with, not an exclusive deal, but a deal with a television network or whatever the case may be. Sometimes you ain't got that. So it's not always possible. But where it is possible, I'm all in favor of fighters being self-promoted. So anyway, back to this dispute between Tony Bellew and Frank Warren. I mean, I certainly wouldn't let me just put this out here because I don't want to get sued by Frank Warren here. The newspapers used to call Frank Warren Frank the Rip because of the fact that he, sued so many people or threatened to sue so many people. Just ask yourself the question, how many fighters over the years have come out on social media, come out in interviews, etc., and accused Frank Warren of not paying them on time? That's a question. I'm just asking that as a question. Go Google it. Go put into Google boxer and, claims Frank Warren didn't pay them on time or they still haven't been paid by Frank Warren. I'm just asking that as a question. I'm not making no accusation. Just go and put that into Google with a question mark at the end. And when you find those stories, investigate further. Then do the same thing with Eddie Hearn. Type into Google how many fighters have not been paid on time by Eddie Hearn. And just see what comes up. That's all I'll tell you. All right? So again, when it comes to who do you trust, Tony Bellew or Frank Warren, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. But as somebody who has been around for a long time and has been following boxing for many decades and following the career of Frank Warren and Tony Bellew and Eddie Hearn and Barry Hearn, out of all those people, Frank Warren would be the person I would trust the least. All right, if I was a fighter, or if I was a fan or a fellow promoter. So that is what that is. But that's all I'll say for now about that situation. Do I trust Eddie Hearn implicitly? Absolutely not. Definitely not. I'm sure he said many things that are untrue, but so is Shelley Finkel, so is Frank Warren, so many people. I mean, an example of Frank Warren would be when he was criticizing David Haye for potentially taking on Shannon Briggs, and it later transpired that Frank Warren had tried to get Shannon Briggs as an opponent for Hughie Fury. I mean, when Frank Warren was confronted about it, he looked very uncomfortable when someone exposed his contradiction. It's one thing to criticize someone for doing something, and then later on down the line, when you're in a certain set of circumstances, you go and do that same thing that which you previously criticized someone else for doing. But it's even worse to criticize someone for something which you have already done recently. And that apparently is what Frank Warren did when it came to the Shannon Briggs situation. Come on, man. Anyway, as far as the whole Deontay Wilder Anthony Joshua situation, who's ducking who's doing what? This one's ducking that one. It's all speculation at the end of the day. None of us are privy to what goes on behind the scenes. None of us have seen the proof of funds. None of us have seen any contracts. All we know for sure is what each party has admitted to. Deontay Wilder's team have admitted openly and publicly to turning down the Anthony Joshua fight twice. They turned down 12 million to fight Joshua in the UK. Then they came with a counter offer. Now we don't know exactly what the counter offer was. We haven't seen the paperwork, but what we do know is that it was a very, very good offer because Eddie Hearn admitted that it was a very good offer. And it was an offer to fight, for Joshua to fight Wilder in the States. And it would have paid Joshua more money than he would get to fight Wilder in the UK. This we do know because Team Joshua, Eddie Hearn, etc. admitted to it. So Wilder turned Joshua down once, Joshua turned Wilder down once, and then there was a second offer from Team Joshua of 15 million to face Deontay Wilder. Deontay Wilder apparently accepted it, but then the WBA called the mandatory for Joshua, Alexander Povetkin, and that meant that Joshua wouldn't be able to take on Wilder next. He'd have to fight Povetkin first and then Wilder afterwards. But that offer stayed on the table, the 15 million. It's now apparently signed and has been sent to Deontay Wilder, or what we know for sure is that Wilder publicly has turned it down. He said, I ain't fighting Joshua for 15 million in April. I ain't signing no contract. Get the hell out of here with that BS. That's what Wilder's saying. So Wilder, we know, is turning down $15 million to fight Anthony Joshua at Wembley in April. So both guys have turned down offers from the other team. And again, it appears to be the case that neither man really wants to travel. Deontay Wilder don't want to travel to the UK for this fight, particularly, or his team. And Anthony Joshua don't want to travel to the US for this fight. That's one thing we know for certain, is Joshua don't want to take this fight in the US because he's had a good offer for the fight and he's turned it down. His own promoter admitted it was a good offer. He didn't take it. So he definitely don't want to fight Wilder in the US, not for the first fight anyway. And Wilder, it seems, don't want to fight Joshua in the UK. If he is willing to fight Joshua in the UK, he's definitely demanding a lot more than 15 million. Right now, that's not realistic. But if he was to fight and beat Tyson Fury, maybe it would be realistic. So let's see. Hopefully, we can get all these shenanigans behind us at some point and have either Joshua and Wilder or Joshua and Fury square off for the undisputed lineal World Heavyweight Championship in 2019. Let's try to be optimistic. Not that it makes a difference, but you know, I'm a glasses half full kind of person, particularly when it comes to boxing. You know, I like to look on the bright side, and I love the sport of boxing. I love this sport. It's a difficult sport to defend because it is a savage and brutal sport, and I'm very candid about that. I'm not one of these people who tries to put boxing in a suit and tie and make out as though it's some type of noble art. No, boxing is savage. Boxing is brutal, and I'm honest about that. That's why I'm not somebody who takes offense too much to trash talk and all those kind of things, because it's a trashy sport, really. I mean, it's two people beating the crap out of each other to the point where sometimes fighters get permanent brain damage. I mean, a lot of fighters get permanent brain damage. That doesn't necessarily mean a blood clot on the brain where they end up in a wheelchair, but a lot of fighters suffer from punch drunk syndrome, for example, and in later life they have all kinds of different symptoms resulting from their career in boxing. So this is a savage sport, and it appeals to something primal within us. And I'm very honest with myself about that, you know. Whatever the case may be, I love the sport, and I want to see the best warriors fight the best. So I'm hopeful that one way or another, we will see a fight for the undisputed heavyweight title next year. Maybe Joshua won't be involved. Maybe it'll be Povetkin taking on Deontay Wilder or Tyson Fury for the undisputed next year. We'll see. Whatever the case may be, let me know how you feel in the comment section below about everything I've discussed in this video. Alright? It's Hearn, I'm out.